I thought I'd found my dream job managing a luxury apartment complex in Austin. But when I accidentally walked into that restaurant and heard my boss laughing about how I was the perfect pawn in his twisted revenge scheme, my blood ran cold. What he didn't know was that I'd been recording everything for weeks, and by the time I was done with him, he'd lose more than just his precious property. He'd lose everything that mattered to his reputation in this city. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last decade learning that in the property management world, trust is a luxury most people can't afford. I've always prided myself on being the kind of person who sees the best in people first, who gives second chances when others wouldn't, and who believes that hard work and genuine care for tenants can turn any struggling property into a thriving community. Maybe that's naive in an industry where profit margins matter more than people, but it's served me well over the years. At least it did until I met Robert Thompson. When Sterling Property Group laid me off last March after their merger with a bigger firm, I thought my world was falling apart. I'd been their assistant property manager for 6 years, had built relationships with hundreds of tenants, and had helped increase occupancy rates at 3 different complexes, from below 70% to consistently above 90%. But numbers on a spreadsheet don't matter when corporate decides to eliminate redundancies, and suddenly I was another casualty of business efficiency. The severance was decent, but with my 8-year-old son Tommy depending on me and rent in Austin climbing every month, I needed to find something quickly. I'd been unemployed for exactly 5 weeks when Lisa Rodriguez, my best friend who manages properties on the other side of town, called me with what seemed like a miracle. She'd heard through the property management network that Robert Thompson, one of Austin's most successful real estate investors, was looking for someone to take over management of his newest acquisition. Riverside Manor Apartments was a 50-unit complex in East Austin that he'd just purchased. And according to Lisa, he was willing to pay 20% above market rate for the right person. The catch was that he needed someone immediately, and he wanted someone with experience turning around struggling properties. Riverside Manor had been hemorrhaging tenants for months under the previous management company. The occupancy rate had dropped to 65%, maintenance requests were backlogged for weeks, and several longtime residents were threatening to break their leases early. It was exactly the kind of challenge I thrived on, the type of property where my skills in tenant relations and operational efficiency could really make a difference. When Lisa gave me Thompson's contact information and told me he was conducting interviews that very week, I updated my resume that same night and sent it over with a cover letter explaining my vision for community-focused property management. Thompson called me the next morning, and his voice was warm, professional, almost fatherly in the way he spoke about wanting to create something special at Riverside Manor. He said he'd reviewed my experience at Sterling and was impressed by my track record of building positive relationships with tenants while maintaining strong financial performance. We talked for almost an hour about my approach to property management, and he seemed genuinely interested in my ideas about creating community events, improving maintenance response times, and developing retention programs for long-term residents. The interview itself took place at his downtown office in one of those gleaming high-rises that overlook Lady Bird Lake. Thompson was exactly what I'd expected from a successful Austin real estate investor. Perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, expensive suit that fit like it was tailored specifically for him, and the kind of confident handshake that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. His office was all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture, with framed photos of his various properties covering one wall like trophies. He offered me coffee from what looked like a machine that cost more than my monthly rent, and we sat in leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. What struck me most during that interview wasn't his obvious wealth or business success, but how genuinely he seemed to care about the tenants at Riverside Manor. He talked about Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, an elderly woman who'd lived in the complex for 15 years and was struggling with the uncertainty of new ownership. He mentioned several young families who were considering moving because they'd lost confidence in the property's management. Thompson said he'd purchased Riverside Manor specifically because he believed it had potential to be something special, a place where people could build real lives instead of just existing in temporary housing. He offered me the position that afternoon with a salary that was 25% higher than what I'd been making at Sterling, plus performance bonuses tied to occupancy rates and tenant satisfaction scores. The benefits package included health insurance for both Tommy and me, and Thompson even mentioned that there was a small apartment in the complex that came with the job if I was interested in living on site. For a single mother who'd been worried about making next month's rent, it felt like winning the lottery. I accepted immediately and agreed to start the following Monday. My first day at Riverside Manor was everything I'd hoped it would be. The complex itself was beautiful. A mid-century building that had been thoughtfully renovated with modern amenities, while preserving its original architectural character. The units were spacious with high ceilings and large windows, and the common areas included a renovated pool, a small fitness center, and a rooftop terrace with views of downtown Austin. It was the kind of place I dreamed of managing, somewhere I could really implement my vision of community-focused property management. The previous management had left behind a mess of disorganized files, ignored maintenance requests, and frustrated tenants. But I'd dealt with worse situations before. I spent my first week meeting with every resident who was willing to talk, listening to their concerns and complaints, and developing a comprehensive plan to address the most pressing issues. Mrs. Hoffman, the elderly tenant Thompson had mentioned, was indeed a treasure. She'd lived in Unit 3B since the complex was first built, and had watched it go through several ownership changes. She was skeptical of me at first, understandably so given how poorly the previous management had treated long-term residents. But she warmed up when I spent over an hour listening to her stories about the building's history and taking detailed notes about her maintenance requests. Thompson checked in regularly during those first few weeks, stopping by the property at least twice a week to see how things were progressing. He seemed genuinely pleased with the improvements I was making, from the way I'd organized the maintenance schedule to the community bulletin board I'd installed in the lobby to help residents connect with each other. When I showed him the occupancy report after my first month, indicating that we'd already increased from 65% to 72%, he actually clapped his hands together and said he knew he'd made the right choice in hiring me. It was during my second month that I started noticing some oddities in the way Thompson conducted business. Nothing dramatic or obviously suspicious, just small things that didn't quite add up. For instance, he always insisted on being personally involved in lease negotiations for certain units, particularly the ones that housed families who'd been at Riverside Manor for several years. When I suggested raising rents to market rate for some of the units that were significantly below current Austin pricing, he told me to hold off, saying he wanted to take a gradual approach that wouldn't displace longtime residents. At the time, I thought this showed remarkable compassion for a real estate investor, but something about the way he selected which units to keep at below-market rates seemed oddly specific. Thompson also had an unusual interest in the building's history and the previous management company, Sterling Property Group's predecessor at the site. During one of our weekly meetings, he spent almost 30 minutes asking me detailed questions about how Sterling had operated, what their relationships with tenants had been like, and whether I knew anything about why they'd lost the management contract. When I mentioned that I'd heard rumors about financial irregularities or tenant complaints, his eyes lit up in a way that seemed disproportionate to casual curiosity. He pressed me for more details, asking if I knew specific names or had heard particular stories about problems under the previous management. The third month was when things started feeling genuinely strange. Thompson began asking me to compile detailed reports on specific long-term tenants, particularly their rental histories, any complaints they'd filed, and their relationships with previous management. He framed these requests as part of developing better tenant retention strategies, but the level of detail he wanted seemed excessive. He wanted to know about Mrs. Hoffman's medical appointments, whether the young family in 2A had ever been late with rent, and what kind of relationship the college students in the studio units had with their parents. When I asked why he needed such personal information, he explained that understanding tenant circumstances would help us provide better customer service, but his explanations felt rehearsed. One afternoon in early July, Thompson asked me to stay late to help him review lease agreements for units that would be coming up for renewal in the fall. We were sitting in the small office I'd set up in the complex's management suite, and he was going through files with an intensity that seemed unusual even for someone known to be detail-oriented. He pulled out the file for Mrs. Hoffman's unit and spent several minutes reading through her lease history, rental payment records, and maintenance requests from the past several years. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He smiled, not the warm professional smile I'd grown accustomed to, but something colder and more calculating. Thompson looked up from Mrs. Hoffman's file and said something I'll never forget, because of how casually he delivered it. He said that Mrs. Hoffman and several other long-term tenants were about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the kind of treatment they'd given other people in the past. When I asked him what he meant, he waved his hand dismissively and said I wouldn't understand the full context, but that some people had been living comfortably for too long without facing consequences for their actions. The way he said it, with that strange smile still on his face, made me feel like I was seeing a completely different person than the compassionate property owner who'd hired me. I tried to push the conversation back to business matters, asking about specific lease renewal terms and maintenance scheduling, but Thompson seemed distracted for the rest of our meeting. He kept returning to questions about tenant histories and relationships, and he made several comments about how satisfying it would be to see certain people get what they deserved. When I finally left the office that evening, I felt unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of who Robert Thompson was and why he'd really purchased Riverside Manor. The next few days passed normally on the surface, but I found myself paying closer attention to Thompson's behavior and comments. I started noticing that his interest in specific tenants seemed to follow patterns I hadn't recognized before. The families he was most curious about were also the ones who'd been most vocal about problems with previous management. The long-term residents he wanted detailed information about were the same ones who'd reportedly filed complaints or caused difficulties for earlier property management companies. Mrs. Hoffman, in particular, seemed to be someone he focused on with an intensity that felt personal rather than professional. It was Lisa who finally helped me put the pieces together. We were having coffee at Central Perk Cafe on a Saturday morning, and I was telling her about some of Thompson's unusual requests and comments. Lisa listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions, until I mentioned his particular interest in Mrs. Hoffman and the other longtime tenants. That's when Lisa's expression changed, and she told me something that made everything click into place. She said that Thompson's previous business partner, Marcus Chin, had mentioned during a networking event that Thompson held serious grudges and never forgot when he felt someone had wronged him professionally. According to Lisa, Marcus had shared a story about how Thompson had spent 2 years planning an elaborate business maneuver to get back at a contractor who'd overcharged him on a renovation project. The contractor ended up losing several major clients and eventually had to close his business, all because Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thompson had systematically undermined his reputation through carefully orchestrated complaints and strategic information sharing. Lisa said Marcus seemed uncomfortable telling the story, like he was warning people about Thompson's vindictive nature without saying so directly. As Lisa talked, I realized that I'd never asked Thompson why he'd specifically purchased Riverside Manor, when he already owned 11 other properties in Austin. I'd assumed it was a good investment opportunity, but what if his motivations were more personal? What if the tenants he was so interested in had somehow been involved in problems that had affected him or his business in the past? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my job might not be about property management at all. It might be about giving Thompson access to people he wanted to target for revenge. That Saturday afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in any of my previous jobs. I started documenting everything. I made copies of all the unusual requests Thompson had made, wrote down every strange comment he'd shared about specific tenants, and began keeping a detailed log of our conversations. I also started being more careful about what information I shared with him, giving him the basic details he needed for legitimate business purposes, while holding back anything that felt too personal or potentially harmful. If Thompson was planning something vindictive, I wasn't going to be an unknowing accomplice. The confirmation I'd been dreading came 2 weeks later in the most unexpected way possible. I'd finished my work at Riverside Manor early and decided to grab dinner at the Brass Monkey, a restaurant downtown that I'd been wanting to try. I was waiting for a table when I heard a familiar laugh from the bar area. I looked over and saw Thompson sitting with Marcus Chen and another man I didn't recognize, all three of them clearly several drinks into what looked like a celebration. Something about Thompson's body language made me step back slightly, positioning myself behind a pillar where I could hear their conversation without being seen. What I heard in the next 10 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about my job, my boss, and the real reason I'd been hired to manage Riverside Manor. Thompson was explaining to his companions how perfectly his plan was working, how he'd found the ideal property manager who was efficient enough to get close to his targets but naive enough not to realize she was being used. He described me as the perfect tool for his revenge, someone who could gather information and build trust with the tenants he wanted to destroy. The way he laughed while describing my work made me feel sick to my stomach, but I forced myself to keep listening because I needed to understand the full scope of what he was planning. Thompson went on to detail his real motivations for purchasing Riverside Manor. Apparently, 3 years earlier, he'd tried to acquire the property through a different management company, but several tenants had organized complaints about his business practices and reputation. Mrs. Hoffman had been particularly vocal, contacting city officials and organizing other residents to oppose the sale. Their efforts had ultimately been successful, preventing Thompson from acquiring the property at that time and costing him what he estimated was over $200,000 in lost opportunity. Now, with the property finally under his control, and me unknowingly providing him with detailed information about his former opponents, Thompson was ready to implement what he called his quote, justice project. He planned to use lease violations, selective rent increases, and strategic maintenance delays to force out the tenants who'd opposed him 3 years earlier. The timeline he described would have most of his targets evicted or driven to move voluntarily within 6 months, and he was particularly excited about the prospect of Mrs. Hoffman having to find new housing at her age. As I stood there listening to Thompson describe his plans for the people I'd grown to care about over the past 3 months, I felt something I'd never experienced before in my professional life. It wasn't just anger or disappointment, but a deep sense of violation that went beyond personal betrayal. Thompson had hired me not because of my skills or experience, but because I was the kind of person who would naturally build relationships with his intended victims. Every positive interaction I'd had with Mrs. Hoffman, every improvement I'd made to benefit long-term residents, every bit of trust I'd built within the community, had been turned into a weapon against the very people I was trying to help. I left the restaurant that night without ordering dinner, my appetite completely gone, and my mind racing with the implications of what I'd learned. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's nightmare. I kept thinking about Mrs. Hoffman showing me old photos of community events from the building's early days, about the young families who'd thanked me for making Riverside Manor feel like home again, about all the ways Thompson could use the information I'd unknowingly provided to hurt people who'd done nothing wrong except stand up for themselves 3 years ago. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to quit my job and leave these people vulnerable to Thompson's revenge scheme. I wasn't going to confront him directly and give him a chance to cover his tracks or accelerate his timeline. Instead, I was going to do something that would require careful planning, absolute discretion, and a level of strategic thinking I'd never had to employ before. I was going to gather evidence of Thompson's real intentions and make sure that when he finally showed his true colors, there would be consequences that extended far beyond Riverside Manor. The morning after overhearing Thompson's conversation at the Brass Monkey, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Tommy was already awake, building an elaborate castle out of cereal boxes at the kitchen table while I made coffee and tried to process everything I'd learned. Looking at my son's innocent concentration on his project, I realized that this wasn't just about protecting the tenants at Riverside Manor anymore. This was about the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of example I wanted to set for Tommy about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I'd spent my entire career in property management building my reputation on trust and integrity. Every landlord who'd hired me, every tenant who'd renewed their lease under my management, every maintenance vendor who'd worked with me had done so because they knew I was reliable and honest. Thompson had weaponized those very qualities against me, turning my genuine care for residents into a tool for his revenge plot. The violation felt personal in a way that went beyond professional betrayal, but it also gave me something valuable: motivation to be more strategic than I'd ever been before. My plan started with a simple realization. If Thompson wanted to use me to gather information about his targets, I could feed him carefully curated details while simultaneously documenting everything for my own purposes. I wouldn't lie outright, but I would become much more selective about what I shared and how I framed it. More importantly, I would start building my own comprehensive record of his requests, comments, and actions. If Thompson was planning to destroy people's lives for the crime of opposing him 3 years ago, I needed evidence that would be strong enough to stop him and protect his intended victims. The first thing I did was set up a secure email account using a service that encrypted messages automatically. I started forwarding copies of all work-related communications to this account, including the unusual requests Thompson had made for detailed tenant information. I also began keeping a digital journal of our conversations, writing detailed summaries immediately after each interaction while the specifics were still fresh in my memory. Every strange comment, every overly personal question about residents, every time his expression shifted when discussing particular tenants went into my private documentation. I also started being more observant about Thompson's behavior patterns. I noticed that he always arrived at Riverside Manor in the early afternoon, usually around 2 o'clock, and he had a habit of walking through the complex alone before coming to the management office. Initially, I'd thought this showed admirable hands-on involvement from a property owner, but now I wondered if he was actually surveilling specific residents. I began tracking his visits, noting which areas of the complex he spent the most time in, and whether his routes corresponded to the units housing his apparent targets. Mrs. Hoffman became an unwitting ally in my information gathering, though I was careful never to involve her directly in anything that might put her at risk. She had an encyclopedic memory of the building's history and a natural curiosity about the various ownership changes over the years. During our regular afternoon conversations, she would often share stories about previous conflicts with management companies, neighborhood development disputes, and the tight-knit community that had formed among long-term residents. Through these conversations, I began to understand the full scope of the opposition Thompson had faced 3 years earlier. According to Mrs. Hoffman, the resistance to Thompson's initial acquisition attempt hadn't been personal animosity, but genuine concern about his reputation for displacing long-term tenants in favor of short-term, higher-paying residents. Several families at Riverside Manor had experienced this pattern at other Thompson properties, where new ownership led to sudden rent increases, selective enforcement of lease violations, and maintenance issues that seemed designed to encourage voluntary departures. Mrs. Hoffman and her neighbors had researched Thompson's business practices thoroughly before organizing their opposition, and their concerns had proven well-founded based on what happened at his other properties afterward. The more I learned about the history, the more I realized that Thompson's targets hadn't just opposed a business transaction. They'd actually protected their community from exactly the kind of treatment he was now planning to inflict. Their victory 3 years ago had preserved affordable housing for dozens of families and maintained the stability that made Riverside Manor such a desirable place to live. Thompson's revenge plot wasn't just vindictive. It was an attack on people who'd done nothing wrong except successfully defend their homes. My relationship with Thompson during this period required a delicate balance of appearing cooperative while actually becoming more guarded. When he asked for updates on specific tenants, I provided factual information about lease statuses and maintenance requests, while omitting personal details that could be used manipulatively. When he inquired about residents' financial situations or family circumstances, I redirected the conversation toward property management logistics. I developed a talent for giving him enough information to satisfy his immediate questions without providing the ammunition he was really seeking. Thompson seemed pleased with my work during this time, frequently complimenting my efficiency and the improvements I'd made to the property's operations. Occupancy had continued climbing, reaching 84% by the end of my 3rd month, and tenant satisfaction scores from my quarterly surveys were the highest the property had seen in years. From his perspective, I was performing exactly as he'd hoped, building relationships with his targets while improving the property's overall value. He had no idea that every positive interaction I had with residents was actually strengthening my resolve to protect them from his schemes. The breakthrough in my evidence gathering came during a staff meeting in mid-August, when Thompson brought Marcus Chen to review the property's financial performance. I'd prepared a comprehensive report showing improved occupancy rates, reduced maintenance costs, and increased tenant retention, but Thompson seemed more interested in discussing specific units and their residents. Marcus appeared uncomfortable as Thompson made pointed comments about certain tenants who would be moving on soon, and he kept glancing at me as if wondering how much I knew about Thompson's real agenda. After the meeting, Marcus lingered while Thompson took one of his walking tours of the complex. I sensed an opportunity and casually mentioned how much I enjoyed working with long-term residents like Mrs. Hoffman, who brought such stability to the community. Marcus's response confirmed my suspicions about Thompson's plans, while also revealing his own discomfort with the situation. He said something about hoping Thompson would be reasonable in his approach to lease renewals, and suggested that revenge was never good business in the long term. The way he spoke suggested he knew more about Thompson's motivations than he was comfortable with. That conversation with Marcus gave me the final piece of confirmation I needed. Thompson's revenge plot wasn't just my interpretation of his comments and behavior. It was real enough that his own business partner was concerned about it. More importantly, Marcus's discomfort suggested that Thompson might not have universal support for his schemes, even among his closest associates. If I could document Thompson's intentions clearly enough, Marcus might be willing to corroborate my account, or at least refuse to support Thompson's actions. I spent the rest of August building my case methodically. Every unusual request went into my encrypted files. Every strange comment got documented with date, time, and context. I started carrying a small digital recorder during our meetings, positioned in my purse where it could capture audio without being obvious. I researched Austin's tenant protection laws and discovered that several of Thompson's proposed actions would likely violate fair housing regulations. Most importantly, I began reaching out quietly to other property managers in Lisa's network, gathering information about Thompson's reputation and any previous complaints against his business practices. The picture that emerged from these investigations was deeply troubling. Thompson had a documented pattern of targeting tenants who'd opposed him or filed complaints about his management. At least 3 other properties had experienced sudden waves of evictions and lease non-renewals following acquisitions by Thompson's company, always affecting residents who'd been vocal about problems or organized opposition to his ownership. In each case, the affected tenants had struggled to find comparable housing in Austin's competitive market, and several families had been forced to leave the city entirely. By early September, I had compiled a comprehensive file documenting Thompson's revenge plot against the Riverside Manor residents. The evidence included audio recordings of his comments about targeting specific tenants, copies of his requests for unusually detailed personal information, documentation of his suspicious behavior patterns during property visits, and research showing his history of retaliatory actions at other properties. I also had contact information for previous victims who might be willing to share their experiences and corroborate the pattern of behavior I'd observed. The question now was how to use this information most effectively. I could report Thompson to housing authorities and hope they would investigate before he implemented his plans, but bureaucratic processes moved slowly, and Thompson might accelerate his timeline if he sensed official scrutiny. I could warn the targeted residents directly, but that would alert Thompson that I knew about his schemes and might prompt him to fire me and bring in someone more compliant. I could try to work with Marcus Chen to pressure Thompson internally, but I had no guarantee that Marcus would choose ethical concerns over business loyalty. What I really needed was a way to expose Thompson's plans that would create immediate consequences while also protecting the residents from retaliation. The solution came to me during a conversation with David Kim, a lawyer friend of Lisa's, who specialized in tenant rights cases. When I described the situation hypothetically, asking about legal protections for residents facing retaliatory actions, David explained that documented evidence of discriminatory intent could make any subsequent evictions or lease violations legally questionable. More importantly, he mentioned that real estate investors were particularly vulnerable to reputation damage because their business model depended heavily on relationships with lenders, contractors, and municipal authorities. David's comments made me realize that Thompson's greatest weakness was the very success and reputation he'd spent years building. His real estate empire depended on maintaining positive relationships throughout Austin's business community, and any serious questions about his ethical practices could have far-reaching consequences beyond just the Riverside Manor situation. If I could expose his revenge plot in a way that reached the right people in Austin's real estate and political networks, the damage to his reputation might be severe enough to stop his plans and protect future tenants from similar treatment. The timing for my counterattack would be crucial. I needed Thompson to reveal his intentions clearly enough that there could be no doubt about his motivations, but I also needed to act before he could harm any of the residents. The opportunity I was waiting for came in late September, when Thompson scheduled what he called a, quote, strategic planning meeting to discuss lease renewals for the following year. He wanted to review every long-term tenant's file in detail and make decisions about rent increases, lease modifications, and what he euphemistically called, quote, community optimization. October in Austin brought cooler mornings and the kind of clear skies that made the city's rapid growth seem like destiny rather than accident. The leaves on the oak trees around Riverside Manor were just beginning to turn, and there was an energy in the air that felt like possibility. For me, that possibility was the chance to turn Thompson's own strategic planning against him in a way that would protect every resident he intended to target. The strategic planning meeting Thompson had scheduled was set for the first Thursday of October, and he'd made it clear that this would be a comprehensive review of our tenant base with an eye toward repositioning the property for maximum profitability. He'd asked me to prepare detailed files on every resident who'd been at Riverside Manor for more than 2 years, with particular attention to their rental history, any complaints they'd filed, and their relationships with previous management. The scope of information he wanted was so extensive that it couldn't possibly serve any legitimate business purpose, which made it perfect evidence of his discriminatory intent. I spent the week before the meeting preparing 2 separate sets of materials. The first was everything Thompson had requested, organized exactly as he'd specified, but I made sure to document every unusual element of his requirements in my private files. The second set was my own comprehensive documentation of his revenge plot, including audio recordings, written communications, and research into his pattern of retaliatory behavior. I'd also prepared a detailed timeline showing how his targeting of specific residents corresponded to their involvement in opposing his acquisition 3 years earlier. The meeting was scheduled for 2:00 in the afternoon, and Thompson had reserved the community room at Riverside Manor so we could spread out all the tenant files and review them systematically. I arrived early to set up the materials and test the positioning of my recording device, which I'd hidden inside a decorative tissue box on the conference table. The room's acoustics were excellent, and I'd tested the setup multiple times to ensure clear audio capture from anywhere Thompson might sit. Thompson arrived precisely on time, carrying his leather portfolio and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested he was looking forward to this meeting. He'd brought Marcus Chen with him, along with someone he introduced as Jennifer Walsh, an attorney who specialized in landlord-tenant law. The presence of a lawyer made me nervous initially, but I realized it actually worked in my favor because any discriminatory statements Thompson made in front of legal counsel would be particularly damning. We started with what Thompson called a portfolio overview, reviewing the property's financial performance and occupancy trends since I'd taken over management. The numbers were impressive. Occupancy had reached 91%, maintenance costs had decreased by 15%, and tenant satisfaction scores were at their highest level in the property's recent history. Thompson seemed genuinely pleased with these results, which made what happened next even more disturbing. After reviewing the overall performance metrics, Thompson shifted his focus to what he called individual tenant analysis. He pulled out Mrs. Hoffman's file first, and the change in his demeanor was immediate and obvious. His voice became harder, his questions more pointed, and he started making comments about how some residents had been, quote, comfortable for too long, and needed to understand that new ownership meant new expectations. Thompson spent almost 20 minutes reviewing Mrs. Hoffman's file, asking detailed questions about her health, her family situation, her financial resources, and her relationships with other residents. When I pointed out that her rent was current, her unit was well maintained, and she'd never had any lease violations, Thompson dismissed these facts as irrelevant. He said the real issue was whether she was the kind of tenant who would support the property's evolution, or whether she represented the old way of doing things that needed to change. The language Thompson used during this discussion was carefully coded, but his meaning was unmistakable. When he talked about tenants who represented the old way of doing things, he was clearly referring to people who'd opposed his previous acquisition attempt. When he mentioned residents who might not support the property's evolution, he meant people who might organize opposition to his plans again. Jennifer Walsh, the attorney, seemed increasingly uncomfortable as Thompson's comments became more specific and personal. Marcus Chen's discomfort was even more obvious. He kept redirecting the conversation toward legitimate business considerations like market rate rent adjustments and standard lease provisions, but Thompson consistently brought the focus back to individual residents and their perceived loyalty or opposition. At one point, Marcus directly asked whether we were discussing business decisions or personal grievances, and Thompson's response was telling. He said that in real estate there was no difference between the two because tenant attitudes affected property values just as much as physical conditions did. As we moved through files for other long-term residents, a clear pattern emerged. Thompson's comments and questions consistently focused on tenants who'd been identified in my research as active opponents of his acquisition 3 years earlier. He wanted to know intimate details about their personal lives, their financial vulnerabilities, and their connections to other residents. For tenants who hadn't been involved in the previous opposition, he showed minimal interest, usually approving standard lease renewals without discussion. The most disturbing part of the meeting came when Thompson began outlining his specific plans for what he called, quote, community restructuring. He explained to Jennifer Walsh that he needed legal strategies for encouraging voluntary departures from residents who weren't, quote, aligned with the property's direction. He wanted to know about selective rent increases, modified lease terms, and enforcement of regulations that hadn't been applied consistently in the past. When Jennifer pointed out that targeting specific tenants could create legal liability, Thompson assured her that everything would be documented as standard business practices. Thompson's confidence during this discussion revealed how carefully he'd planned his revenge campaign. He'd researched the legal boundaries thoroughly and developed strategies that would technically comply with housing laws while creating enough pressure to force out his targets. He talked about scheduling maintenance work during hours that would inconvenience elderly residents, implementing new policies that would disproportionately affect families with children, and enforcing lease provisions that had been overlooked for years. Each strategy by itself might be defensible, but the pattern of targeting specific residents based on their past opposition was clearly discriminatory. The breakthrough moment came when Marcus Chen challenged Thompson directly about the ethics of his approach. Marcus pointed out that Mrs. Hoffman and the other targeted residents were exactly the kind of stable, long-term tenants that most property owners valued, and he questioned whether forcing them out served any legitimate business purpose. Thompson's response was everything I needed to prove his discriminatory intent. Thompson told Marcus that business wasn't just about monthly rent payments and maintenance costs. He said that tenants who'd proven they could organize effective opposition to ownership decisions represented an ongoing threat to property management, regardless of their individual behavior as renters. He wanted residents who would accept management decisions without question, not people who demonstrated they could rally community support for challenges to his authority. The way he spoke about it made clear that this wasn't about business efficiency. It was about eliminating people who'd successfully opposed him in the past. Jennifer Walsh's reaction to Thompson's explanation was professionally controlled but obviously concerned. She started asking more pointed questions about the documentation we had for targeting specific residents, and she emphasized repeatedly that any actions taken against tenants would need clear business justifications that could withstand legal scrutiny. Her tone suggested she was trying to protect Thompson from his own vindictive impulses, but Thompson seemed confident that his careful planning would prevent any legal problems. As the meeting continued, Thompson became increasingly explicit about his intentions. He talked about the satisfaction he would feel watching Mrs. Hoffman struggle to find comparable housing at her age, and he speculated about whether the young families he was targeting would be forced to leave Austin entirely when they couldn't find affordable alternatives. The casual cruelty in his voice was chilling, but it was also exactly the kind of evidence I needed to demonstrate that his actions were motivated by revenge rather than legitimate business concerns. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours, and by the end, I had recorded Thompson making dozens of statements that clearly demonstrated discriminatory intent. He'd outlined specific plans for targeting individual residents based on their past opposition to his ownership, expressed personal satisfaction at the prospect of their displacement, and dismissed legitimate business considerations in favor of retaliatory actions. Jennifer Walsh had documented her concerns about the legal risks, and Marcus Chen had repeatedly questioned the ethics and business logic of Thompson's approach. When the meeting finally ended, Thompson seemed satisfied that he'd laid the groundwork for implementing his revenge plot. He scheduled individual meetings with each of the targeted residents for the following week, ostensibly to discuss lease renewals, but actually to begin applying pressure for voluntary departures. He also asked me to start documenting any minor lease violations or maintenance issues in the targeted units, creating a paper trail that could be used to justify future actions. As Thompson and his companions left Riverside Manor that afternoon, I sat alone in the community room surrounded by tenant files and my hidden recording equipment. The weight of what I'd heard was overwhelming, but so was the clarity of my next steps. Thompson had given me everything I needed to expose his revenge plot and protect his intended victims. Now I needed to use that evidence strategically to create consequences that would stop his plans and prevent him from targeting vulnerable tenants at other properties. The first thing I did was secure copies of all the recordings from the meeting, uploading them to multiple encrypted storage services and making backup copies on separate devices. I also documented every specific threat or discriminatory statement Thompson had made, creating a detailed transcript with timestamps and context. The evidence was clear and comprehensive, but I needed to present it in a way that would create immediate pressure to stop Thompson's plans while also protecting the targeted residents from retaliation. That evening, I called David Kim and asked if we could meet urgently to discuss a tenant rights case that had developed beyond the hypothetical scenario I described previously. David agreed to see me the next morning, and I spent the night preparing a comprehensive presentation of the evidence I'd gathered. I had audio recordings, written documentation, research into Thompson's history of retaliatory actions, and detailed plans for targeting specific residents based on their past opposition to his ownership. The morning I met with David Kim felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I jumped, there would be no going back to the relative safety of ignorance and inaction. David's office was in a converted house near the University of Texas campus, the kind of place that felt more like a community center than a traditional law firm. His practice focused on tenant rights and affordable housing advocacy, which meant he'd seen every kind of landlord abuse and retaliatory action imaginable. When I finished playing the most damning excerpts from Thompson's strategic planning meeting, David's expression was grim, but not surprised. David explained that the evidence I'd gathered was more than sufficient to prove discriminatory intent, which could make any subsequent actions against the targeted residents legally problematic for Thompson. However, he also warned that real estate investors like Thompson usually had excellent legal representation and deep pockets for extended litigation. The most effective approach would be to create immediate public pressure that would make continuing his revenge plot more costly than abandoning it. David suggested a multi-pronged strategy that would expose Thompson's plans through several channels simultaneously. First, we would file complaints with Austin's Fair Housing Office and the Texas Real Estate Commission, providing detailed documentation of Thompson's discriminatory statements and retaliatory intentions. Second, we would reach out to local housing advocacy organizations and tenant rights groups, giving them access to the evidence so they could publicize the case and create community pressure. Finally, we would contact local media outlets with the story, framing it as a broader issue about gentrification and tenant displacement in Austin. The timeline David recommended was aggressive. We needed to file all complaints and contact all media outlets within the same week, creating a coordinated exposure that would be harder for Thompson to manage or control. This approach would also protect the targeted residents by making any subsequent actions against them obviously retaliatory and legally questionable. David offered to handle the legal filings and media contacts directly, which would keep my name out of the initial reports and provide some protection from immediate retaliation. I spent the weekend preparing for what David called Evidence Disclosure Week. I organized all my documentation into clear categories, prepared written summaries of Thompson's statements and actions, and compiled contact information for previous tenants who'd experienced similar treatment at Thompson's other properties. I also wrote detailed accounts of my own experiences working for Thompson, focusing on the ways he'd used my position to gather information about his intended targets. The first complaint was filed Monday morning with Austin's Fair Housing Office. David presented the evidence as a clear case of discriminatory housing practices, with audio recordings and written documentation showing Thompson's intent to target specific residents based on their protected activities under fair housing law. The complaint included transcripts of Thompson's most damning statements, research into his pattern of retaliatory behavior, and detailed information about each of the targeted residents. Tuesday, David filed a complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission, alleging that Thompson's conduct violated professional standards for property management and real estate investment. This complaint focused on Thompson's abuse of his position as a property owner to pursue personal vendettas against tenants, and it included evidence of his systematic gathering of personal information for non-business purposes. The Real Estate Commission had the authority to investigate Thompson's business practices and potentially revoke his professional licenses. Wednesday was Media Day. David had prepared a comprehensive press packet, including audio excerpts, written summaries, and background research on Thompson's business practices. He'd contacted 3 local media outlets, Austin Business Journal, KXAN News, and the Austin Chronicle. Each outlet approached the story from a different angle, but all of them recognized the broader implications for tenant rights and affordable housing in Austin's rapidly changing market. The Austin Business Journal focused on the implications for real estate investors and property managers, presenting Thompson's case as an example of how personal grievances could create legal and financial risks for property owners. Their article included quotes from housing law experts about the legal standards for legitimate business decisions versus discriminatory practices, and it positioned Thompson's behavior as professionally questionable even beyond the ethical concerns. KXAN News approached the story as a human interest piece about vulnerable tenants facing displacement, interviewing Mrs. Hoffman and other residents about their experiences at Riverside Manor and their concerns about new ownership. The television coverage was particularly powerful because it put faces and personal stories to the abstract legal issues, showing viewers exactly who would be harmed by Thompson's revenge plot. The Austin Chronicle took the most aggressive approach, framing Thompson's case as part of a broader pattern of gentrification and displacement affecting long-term Austin residents. Their article connected Thompson's targeting of specific tenants to larger issues about affordable housing and community stability, presenting his revenge plot as an example of how wealthy investors could use legal technicalities to harm vulnerable residents. Thursday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 34 text messages, most of them from Thompson. The media coverage had started appearing online Wednesday evening, and by Thursday morning the story was trending on local social media, with hashtags like #Riverside Manor Scandal and #TenantJusticeATX. Thompson's first messages were confused and demanding, asking what I knew about the media reports, and whether I'd been contacted by journalists. As the day progressed, his messages became increasingly angry and accusatory. I didn't respond to any of Thompson's communications immediately. David had advised me to let him handle all contact with Thompson's legal team, while I focused on documenting any retaliatory actions Thompson might take against me or the residents. I also started receiving supportive messages from other property managers in Lisa's network, many of whom shared their own stories about Thompson's vindictive behavior and thanked me for speaking out. The impact on Thompson's business became apparent almost immediately. By Thursday afternoon, local housing advocacy groups were organizing protests outside Thompson Tower, and several Austin City Council members had issued statements calling for investigations into discriminatory housing practices. More importantly, other tenants at Thompson's properties started coming forward with their own stories about retaliatory actions and discriminatory treatment. Marcus Chen called me Thursday evening, and his message was brief but significant. He said he'd seen the media coverage and wanted me to know that he supported my decision to expose Thompson's plans. More importantly, he mentioned that he was reconsidering his business partnership with Thompson, in light of the revelations about his approach to tenant relations. Marcus's public distancing from Thompson would be particularly damaging because it came from someone with insider knowledge of Thompson's business practices. Friday brought the news I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect so quickly. David called me in the morning to report that Thompson's attorney had contacted him, requesting a meeting to discuss resolving the current misunderstanding before it caused further damage to Thompson's reputation. The lawyer's tone suggested that Thompson was already feeling significant pressure from the negative publicity and wanted to minimize further exposure. The meeting between David and Thompson's legal team took place Friday afternoon, and David called me immediately afterward to report the results. Thompson was willing to make several significant concessions to avoid further negative publicity and potential legal liability. First, he would guarantee that none of the residents identified in the media coverage would face any retaliatory actions, including rent increases, lease modifications, or eviction proceedings. Second, he would establish a formal complaint process for tenants at all his properties, with independent oversight to prevent future discrimination. Finally, he would pay for independent legal representation for any of the targeted residents who wanted to review their lease agreements and tenant rights. Most importantly for my own situation, Thompson had agreed not to retaliate against me for exposing his plans, and he would provide a positive employment reference if I chose to seek other positions. However, David strongly recommended that I not continue working for Thompson given the level of animosity the situation had created. We agreed that I would submit my resignation the following week, giving Thompson enough time to find replacement management for Riverside Manor. The weekend felt surreal after the intensity of the previous week. I spent Saturday at Riverside Manor, checking in with residents and addressing their concerns about the media coverage and what it meant for their housing security. Mrs. Hoffman was particularly grateful, telling me that she'd been worried about Thompson's intentions since the day he purchased the property. She said that knowing someone had been looking out for the residents' interests made her feel secure in her home for the first time in months. Several other residents expressed similar gratitude, but what struck me most was their surprise that someone in a management position had prioritized their welfare over employer loyalty. It made me realize how normalized retaliatory behavior had become in Austin's rental market, and how rarely tenants had advocates willing to risk their own positions to protect resident rights. Sunday evening, I drafted my resignation letter to Thompson. I kept it brief and professional, stating that I was resigning my position effective in 2 weeks and offering to assist with the transition to new management. I didn't mention the media coverage or the legal complaints, focusing instead on thanking him for the opportunity to work at Riverside Manor and expressing confidence that the property would continue to thrive under new management. The morning I submitted my resignation to Thompson, Austin was experiencing one of those perfect October days that make living in Texas worth enduring the summer heat. The sky was impossibly blue, the air had that crisp quality that promised cooler weather ahead, and there was an energy around the city that felt like change was not just possible but inevitable. For me, that change was the transition from victim to victor, in a situation that could have destroyed everything I'd worked to build in my career. Thompson's response to my resignation was exactly what I'd expected. Professionally polite on the surface, but seething with barely controlled anger underneath. He accepted my 2 weeks' notice without argument, but he made several pointed comments about loyalty and discretion that were clearly intended as warnings about future conduct. His behavior during our final interactions confirmed everything I'd learned about his vindictive nature, but it also showed me that the public exposure had genuinely rattled him in ways that private confrontation never could have achieved. The 2 weeks I spent transitioning my responsibilities were among the most satisfying of my career. Every positive interaction I had with residents, every efficient resolution of maintenance issues, every small improvement to community life at Riverside Manor felt like a direct contradiction of Thompson's plans to use my position for harmful purposes. I was particularly careful to document all my work thoroughly, creating detailed records that would make it easy for my replacement to continue the positive momentum without missing any important details. During this transition period, the broader impact of exposing Thompson's revenge plot became increasingly apparent. The media coverage had sparked a citywide conversation about tenant rights and displacement, with several Austin City Council members proposing new regulations to protect long-term residents from retaliatory actions. Housing advocacy organizations were using Thompson's case as an example of why stronger tenant protections were needed. And other property managers were sharing their own stories about pressures to prioritize profit over resident welfare. More personally satisfying was the response from my professional network. Lisa Rodriguez told me that several property management companies had contacted her asking for my resume, impressed by my willingness to prioritize ethical concerns over employment security. David Kim mentioned that housing advocacy organizations were interested in consulting with me about developing better protections for property managers who witness discriminatory practices. Even Marcus Chen reached out to discuss potential opportunities with property management companies that prioritized community development over maximum profit extraction. The investigation by Austin's Fair Housing Office moved forward more quickly than anyone had expected, partly because Thompson's recorded statements provided such clear evidence of discriminatory intent. The investigator assigned to the case told David that they rarely received complaints with such comprehensive documentation, and Thompson's own words made it impossible for him to claim that his targeting of specific residents was based on legitimate business considerations. The Texas Real Estate Commission's investigation proceeded more slowly, but David received unofficial word that they were taking the complaint seriously and would likely require Thompson to complete additional education about fair housing practices and professional ethics. More importantly, the commission was reviewing Thompson's conduct at other properties to determine whether the Riverside Manor situation represented an isolated incident or a pattern of problematic behavior. The most unexpected consequence of exposing Thompson's plans was the response from other tenants throughout his property portfolio. Within 2 weeks of the initial media coverage, tenants from 5 different Thompson properties had contacted David's office with their own stories about retaliatory actions, discriminatory treatment, and suspicious targeting of residents who'd filed complaints or organized opposition to management decisions. The pattern that emerged suggested that Thompson's revenge plot against Riverside Manor residents was just one example of a much broader approach to tenant relations. These additional complaints created a snowball effect that far exceeded anything I'd anticipated when I first decided to document Thompson's behavior. What had started as an effort to protect specific residents at one property had become a comprehensive investigation into Thompson's business practices across his entire real estate portfolio. The legal and financial consequences he was facing were severe enough that Marcus Chen publicly announced the dissolution of their business partnership, citing irreconcilable differences about ethical standards in property management. My last day at Riverside Manor was bittersweet, in the way that endings often are when they represent both loss and liberation. I genuinely enjoyed the work of managing the property and building relationships with residents. But I also knew that staying would have meant continuing to work for someone who'd fundamentally betrayed my trust and attempted to use my position for harmful purposes. Mrs. Hoffman organized a small farewell gathering in the community room, and several residents expressed gratitude for my advocacy on their behalf. The replacement manager Thompson hired was someone I'd worked with briefly at Sterling Property Group, a competent professional who understood the importance of resident relations, but also had enough experience to recognize potential ethical problems. During our transition meetings, I was careful to brief her thoroughly about the recent events and the ongoing investigations, ensuring that she would be prepared to resist any pressure to implement discriminatory practices. I also made sure she had contact information for David Kim and other resources if she encountered situations that made her uncomfortable. The weeks following my departure from Riverside Manor brought a steady stream of positive developments. The Fair Housing Office investigation concluded with a finding that Thompson had violated several provisions of federal and state housing law, resulting in substantial fines and a requirement for ongoing monitoring of his business practices. The Real Estate Commission imposed additional penalties and educational requirements, and they placed Thompson's properties under enhanced scrutiny for potential future violations. More satisfying than the official sanctions were the practical consequences Thompson faced in Austin's tight-knit real estate community. Several contractors and vendors who'd worked with his properties announced that they would no longer accept projects from Thompson Real Estate Holdings, citing concerns about being associated with discriminatory practices. 2 major banks that had provided financing for Thompson's acquisitions initiated reviews of their lending relationships, expressing concerns about reputational risks associated with his business practices. The impact on Thompson's personal reputation was equally significant. Austin's real estate investment community is relatively small, and news about ethical violations spreads quickly through professional networks. Thompson found himself excluded from industry events and deal-making opportunities, as other investors worried about guilt by association. The social and professional isolation he experienced was particularly ironic, given that his revenge plot had been motivated by anger about being opposed by tenant organizers. 6 months after leaving Riverside Manor, I accepted a position as regional property manager for a nonprofit organization that develops affordable housing throughout Central Texas. The work involves managing properties specifically designed to serve low-income families and elderly residents, exactly the kind of people Thompson had targeted for displacement. My experience exposing his revenge plot had given me credibility in housing advocacy circles and demonstrated my commitment to prioritizing resident welfare over employer demands. The new position pays slightly less than what Thompson had offered, but it comes with the satisfaction of knowing that my work directly contributes to housing stability for vulnerable populations. I also serve as a consultant for David Kim's practice, helping other property managers recognize and document discriminatory practices they observe in their work. The combination of direct service and advocacy feels like the natural evolution of my career, building on everything I learned about the intersection of housing policy and individual human dignity. Mrs. Hoffman and I still keep in touch regularly, and she continues to thrive at Riverside Manor under management that respects long-term residents and prioritizes community building. The property's occupancy rate has remained high, and tenant satisfaction scores have continued improving under leadership that views residents as valued community members rather than potential obstacles to profit maximization. The young families Thompson had targeted are still living there, contributing to the stable, diverse community that makes Riverside Manor such a desirable place to live. Thompson's real estate empire, meanwhile, has contracted significantly as a result of the ongoing legal and reputational consequences from his revenge plot. He's been forced to sell several properties at below-market prices, and his ability to obtain financing for new acquisitions has been severely limited by his damaged reputation in Austin's banking community. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in early November, just as Austin's brief autumn was giving way to the unpredictable weather patterns that mark the beginning of winter in Central Texas. I was reviewing lease applications for a new affordable housing development when David Kim called with news that made my coffee grow cold as I listened. The investigation into Thompson's business practices had uncovered something far more disturbing than his revenge plot against Riverside Manor residents. A systematic pattern of financial fraud that stretched back over 3 years and involved multiple properties across Austin. The discovery had come about almost accidentally, as investigators from the Fair Housing Office examined Thompson's rental records and lease agreements looking for evidence of discriminatory practices. What they found instead were discrepancies in reported rental income, manipulated occupancy records, and a complex scheme involving phantom tenants and falsified lease agreements. Thompson had been inflating his property's financial performance to secure better loan terms from banks, while simultaneously underreporting income to reduce tax obligations. The scheme was sophisticated enough that it had gone undetected by routine audits, but the intensive scrutiny triggered by my discrimination complaint had exposed financial irregularities that couldn't be explained away. David explained that the financial fraud investigation was being handled by federal authorities, since it involved bank fraud and tax evasion across state lines. The FBI had seized Thompson's business records and frozen several of his accounts while they conducted a comprehensive review of his financial dealings. More importantly for me personally, investigators wanted to interview me about my observations of Thompson's business practices during my time as property manager. My position had given me access to rental records and financial reports that could provide crucial evidence about when and how the fraudulent practices had been implemented. The irony wasn't lost on me that Thompson's vindictive targeting of elderly tenants and young families had ultimately led to the exposure of crimes that could send him to federal prison. If he had simply managed his properties ethically and legally, my discrimination complaint would never have triggered the kind of intensive investigation that uncovered his financial schemes. His obsession with revenge had become the instrument of his own destruction, creating exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd spent years trying to avoid. The federal investigation moved with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made Thompson's earlier confidence seem pathetically naive. FBI agents interviewed dozens of current and former employees, examined years of financial records, and contacted tenants at all of Thompson's properties to verify lease agreements and rental payments. They also investigated his relationships with contractors, lenders, and municipal officials, looking for evidence of additional criminal activity beyond the financial fraud. My interview with federal investigators lasted over 6 hours and covered everything from Thompson's day-to-day business practices to the specific comments he'd made about targeting individual tenants. The agents were particularly interested in my observations about discrepancies between reported occupancy rates and actual rental income, since these irregularities had been among the first clues that led to discovering the broader fraud scheme. They also wanted detailed information about Thompson's interactions with Marcus Chen and other business associates, looking for evidence about who else might have been involved in or aware of the criminal activity. The interview process was intimidating, but also validating in ways I hadn't expected. The federal agents treated my observations and documentation as crucial evidence, and they praised the thoroughness of the records I'd kept during my time working for Thompson. One agent mentioned that employee whistleblowers often provided the most valuable evidence in white-collar crime cases, since they had access to day-to-day operations that external investigators couldn't observe directly. Knowing that my decision to document Thompson's behavior had contributed to exposing serious criminal activity made all the stress and uncertainty of the past months feel worthwhile. The impact on Thompson's business empire was immediate and devastating. Within days of the FBI seizing his records, several major contractors terminated their relationships with his company, citing concerns about potential legal liability. Banks that had provided financing for his properties initiated immediate reviews of their loan agreements, and at least 2 lenders moved to accelerate repayment schedules based on material adverse change clauses in their contracts. Thompson's ability to operate his real estate business effectively was crippled even before any formal charges were filed. Marcus Chen's decision to publicly dissolve their business partnership proved to be prescient, as investigators determined that Thompson had been operating the fraudulent schemes without his partner's knowledge. Marcus cooperated fully with the investigation and provided additional evidence about Thompson's secretive approach to financial management. His willingness to testify about Thompson's deceptive practices eliminated any possibility that Thompson could claim the fraud was the result of accounting errors or misunderstandings, rather than deliberate criminal activity. The media coverage of the federal investigation dwarfed the attention my original discrimination complaint had received. Major news outlets across Texas picked up the story, framing it as an example of how unchecked greed and vindictive behavior could lead real estate investors into increasingly serious criminal activity. The narrative that emerged portrayed Thompson as someone whose personal grievances had clouded his business judgment so severely that he'd risked everything for the satisfaction of hurting people who'd opposed him years earlier. For the residents of Riverside Manor and Thompson's other properties, the federal investigation created both relief and uncertainty. Relief because Thompson's criminal liability made any retaliation against tenant complainants impossible, but uncertainty about what would happen to their housing as his real estate empire collapsed under legal pressure. Federal authorities assured tenant advocates that protecting existing lease agreements would be a priority in any asset seizure or bankruptcy proceedings, but the residents still faced the stress of not knowing who would own or manage their homes in the coming months. Mrs. Hoffman, with her characteristic blend of wisdom and humor, told me that she'd lived through enough changes of ownership at Riverside Manor to know that uncertainty was temporary but community was permanent. She'd started organizing residents to document their positive experiences under current management and advocate collectively for stable, ethical ownership if the property went up for sale. Her leadership during this stressful period reminded me why Thompson's plan to target her had been so misguided. She was exactly the kind of resident who made properties more valuable through her contributions to community stability and morale. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Thompson's vindictive approach to business had isolated him from potential allies and support systems. Other real estate investors who might have provided financial assistance or legal support during a crisis were unwilling to associate themselves with someone whose criminal behavior could damage their own reputations. Professional organizations that Thompson had been active in quickly distanced themselves from the scandal, removing him from leadership positions and canceling speaking engagements he'd been scheduled to present. As winter settled over Austin and the investigation continued, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that evening in July, when I'd overheard Thompson's conversation at the Brass Monkey. What had started as a dream job managing a beautiful property had become a lesson in the importance of trusting my instincts and standing up for vulnerable people even when doing so required personal risk. The experience had taught me that ethical compromises rarely remain small, and that people who abuse power in one area of their lives usually do so in others as well. The transition to my new position with the affordable housing nonprofit felt like stepping into a completely different world, one where resident welfare was the primary goal rather than an obstacle to profit maximization. My colleagues were social workers, community organizers, and housing advocates who viewed property management as a tool for social justice rather than wealth accumulation. The contrast with Thompson's approach to real estate investment couldn't have been more stark, and it reinforced my conviction that I'd made the right choice in exposing his discriminatory and criminal behavior. Working in affordable housing also gave me a broader perspective on the systemic issues that had made Thompson's behavior possible. Austin's rapid growth and rising housing costs had created enormous pressure on low-income residents, making them vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous landlords who knew that tenants had few alternatives. The discrimination and fraud I'd witnessed at Thompson's properties were symptoms of a larger problem: a housing market where demand so exceeded supply that landlords could abuse tenants with minimal consequences. My experience with Thompson became a case study that David Kim used in workshops for property managers about recognizing and reporting discriminatory practices. The comprehensive documentation I'd maintained, and the successful prosecution that resulted, demonstrated the importance of keeping detailed records and having access to legal resources when witnessing employer misconduct. Several other property managers contacted me after these workshops to share their own experiences with employers who'd pressured them to implement discriminatory practices or overlook tenant rights violations. The federal criminal charges against Thompson were filed on a cold February morning that felt appropriate for such a grim milestone. David Kim called me with the news just as I was reviewing applications for a new senior housing development, and the timing felt symbolic of how my life had moved from documenting destruction to facilitating creation. The indictment included 19 counts of bank fraud, 12 counts of tax evasion, and 7 counts of wire fraud, representing a comprehensive accounting of Thompson's criminal activity over the past 4 years. The charges carried potential sentences that could keep Thompson in federal prison for decades, but what struck me most about the indictment was how thoroughly it documented the connection between his personal vendettas and his criminal behavior. Federal prosecutors had traced the beginning of his most aggressive fraudulent schemes to the period immediately after his failed attempt to acquire Riverside Manor 3 years earlier. His anger about being opposed by tenant organizers had apparently motivated him to pursue increasingly risky financial manipulations to demonstrate his power and success. Reading through the indictment was like seeing a complete map of everything I'd observed and suspected during my time working for Thompson. The phantom leases I'd noticed discrepancies in were detailed extensively, along with the methods Thompson had used to inflate occupancy rates and rental income figures. The falsified maintenance records I'd found confusing were explained as part of a scheme to minimize reported expenses while maximizing claimed property values for loan applications. Most disturbing was the revelation that Thompson had been using rental deposits and advance payments from legitimate tenants to fund his personal expenses and real estate acquisitions. This meant that residents at his properties had unknowingly been financing his criminal activities through their security deposits and rent payments. The thought that Mrs. Hoffman and other vulnerable tenants had been subsidizing Thompson's fraud while he planned their displacement added another layer of violation to his already despicable behavior. The media coverage of Thompson's indictment was extensive and uniformly negative, with local news outlets using his case to illustrate broader problems in Austin's rental housing market. Editorial writers connected his story to larger issues about oversight of real estate investors and protection of tenant rights, arguing that his criminal behavior had been enabled by regulatory systems that prioritized business interests over resident welfare. The coverage also highlighted the role that employee whistleblowers like me played in exposing corporate criminal activity that might otherwise remain hidden for years. Thompson's arrest took place at his downtown office, and local news stations carried footage of him being led away in handcuffs, while FBI agents carried boxes of evidence from his building. The visual symbolism was powerful. A man who had used his wealth and position to harm vulnerable people was finally being held accountable by a justice system that had previously seemed indifferent to his victims' suffering. For residents who had been targeted by his revenge plots or financial schemes, seeing Thompson in custody provided a sense of closure that no civil settlement could have delivered. The collapse of Thompson's business empire accelerated rapidly after his arrest. Properties that had been struggling with management issues under his criminal leadership were seized by federal authorities and placed under court-appointed management, while asset forfeiture proceedings moved forward. Tenants at these properties finally received the competent, ethical management they deserved, with professional managers who prioritized maintenance, safety, and resident satisfaction over extracting maximum profit. Marcus Chen's cooperation with federal investigators proved invaluable in documenting the full scope of Thompson's criminal activity. As his former business partner, Marcus had access to financial records and communications that provided crucial evidence about Thompson's methods and timeline. His willingness to testify honestly about Thompson's deceptive practices eliminated any possibility of claiming that the fraud was accidental or the result of poor bookkeeping, rather than deliberate criminal intent. The impact on Austin's real estate investment community was significant and lasting. Thompson's case prompted increased scrutiny of investor practices and stronger enforcement of existing regulations designed to protect tenants and prevent financial fraud. Several local banks announced enhanced due diligence procedures for real estate loans, including more thorough verification of rental income and occupancy claims. Professional organizations began requiring additional ethics training for members and implementing stronger disciplinary procedures for reported violations. For me personally, Thompson's indictment represented validation that my decision to speak out had been morally and practically justified. The months of stress and uncertainty about retaliation and career consequences had been difficult, but seeing the full extent of Thompson's criminal behavior confirmed that staying silent would have enabled continued harm to vulnerable people. The comprehensive nature of the federal charges also meant that my discrimination complaint had been just the tip of an iceberg of illegal activity that needed to be exposed and prosecuted. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the federal court system, but regular updates from David Kim kept me informed about significant developments. Thompson's legal team initially attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would have reduced the charges and allowed him to retain some of his assets, but federal prosecutors were uninterested in compromising given the extensive evidence of deliberate criminal activity. The government's position was that Thompson's behavior had been too systematic and harmful to warrant leniency in sentencing. During this period, I received several requests for media interviews about my experience working for Thompson and my decision to expose his discriminatory practices. I was selective about which opportunities to accept, focusing on outlets that treated the story as a serious examination of housing policy and tenant rights rather than sensational crime coverage. My goal was to ensure that the broader lessons about protecting vulnerable residents weren't lost in the drama of Thompson's personal downfall. One interview that was particularly meaningful was with a housing advocacy publication that reached property managers and real estate professionals throughout Texas. The article used my experience to encourage other industry employees to report discriminatory or criminal behavior they observed in their work, emphasizing the legal protections available to whistleblowers and the importance of documenting misconduct thoroughly. Several readers contacted me afterward to share their own experiences and ask for advice about reporting problems they'd witnessed. The ongoing federal case also provided opportunities to advocate for systematic changes that could prevent similar situations in the future. I testified before Austin City Council about the need for stronger oversight of property management practices and better protection for tenants facing retaliatory actions. The specific examples from Thompson's case helped illustrate why existing regulations were insufficient and what kinds of reforms would be most effective in protecting vulnerable residents. Working in affordable housing during this period gave me daily reminders of why exposing Thompson's behavior had been necessary and worthwhile. Every family I helped secure stable housing, every elderly resident who received prompt maintenance service, every community event that brought neighbors together represented the positive alternative to Thompson's exploitative approach to property management. The contrast between ethical and unethical practices was stark enough that I never doubted my decision to prioritize tenant welfare over employer loyalty. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Thompson had been planning to expand his revenge tactics beyond Riverside Manor to target tenant advocates and organizers at other properties throughout Austin. Federal agents found communications indicating that he'd been compiling lists of troublesome residents across his portfolio and developing strategies to force them out through coordinated harassment and selective enforcement of lease violations. The scope of his vindictive planning was far broader than anyone had realized, making the intervention that stopped his plans even more significant. The trial of Robert Thompson began on a humid Monday morning in late August, almost exactly 1 year after I'd overheard his conversation at the Brass Monkey that had started this entire journey. Federal court in Austin was packed with journalists, housing advocates, and former tenants who'd been affected by Thompson's criminal schemes. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, but also heavy with the weight of all the harm that had been documented during the investigation. For many of us, this trial represented the culmination of months of uncertainty and the promise of finally seeing justice delivered. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, opened the government's case with a methodical presentation of Thompson's fraudulent practices that painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning multiple years and properties. She used financial records, recorded conversations, and witness testimony to demonstrate how Thompson had deliberately inflated property values, falsified rental income, and manipulated occupancy records to defraud banks and avoid tax obligations. The prosecution's case was comprehensive and devastating, leaving little room for Thompson's defense team to claim ignorance or argue that the irregularities were accidental. My testimony was scheduled for the third day of the trial, and I spent the previous evening reviewing my notes and recordings to ensure I could present a clear, chronological account of my observations. David Kim had prepared me thoroughly for the experience of testifying in federal court, but nothing could completely eliminate the nervousness I felt about confronting Thompson directly in such a formal setting. When I entered the courtroom that morning, Thompson avoided making eye contact, staring instead at legal documents or conferring quietly with his attorneys. The prosecutor's questions focused on my observations of Thompson's business practices and the specific statements he'd made about targeting individual tenants for retaliatory actions. I described the strategic planning meeting where Thompson had outlined his revenge plot in detail, including his expressed satisfaction at the prospect of displacing elderly residents and young families. The audio recordings I'd made were played for the jury, and Thompson's own words provided the most damning evidence of his discriminatory intent and criminal mindset. During cross-examination, Thompson's defense attorney attempted to portray me as a disgruntled employee who had misinterpreted normal business discussions and recorded conversations without consent. However, the comprehensive nature of my documentation and the corroborating evidence from other sources made these attacks ineffective. The defense strategy seemed designed more to create reasonable doubt about specific details than to challenge the overall narrative of Thompson's criminal behavior, suggesting that his legal team recognized the strength of the government's case. Mrs. Hoffman's testimony was particularly powerful, as she described the fear and uncertainty that Thompson's threats had created for long-term residents of Riverside Manor. Her dignity and clarity while recounting her experiences provided a human face for the harm that Thompson's schemes had caused, and several jury members appeared visibly moved by her account. She also testified about the improvements in property management and community life that had occurred after Thompson's criminal activity was exposed and stopped. Marcus Chen's testimony provided crucial insider perspective on Thompson's business operations and decision-making processes. As Thompson's former business partner, Marcus had observed the progression from legitimate real estate investment to increasingly aggressive and ultimately criminal behavior. His account of trying to discourage Thompson from pursuing vindictive actions against tenants highlighted how Thompson's personal grievances had overridden sound business judgment and ethical considerations. The financial evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Federal investigators had traced hundreds of fraudulent transactions, documented dozens of falsified lease agreements, and identified systematic patterns of income manipulation across Thompson's entire property portfolio. Expert witnesses explained how Thompson's schemes had inflated his apparent net worth by millions of dollars while allowing him to avoid hundreds of thousands in tax obligations. Perhaps most damaging to Thompson's case was evidence that he had continued his fraudulent activities even after my discrimination complaint had triggered initial investigations. Rather than ceasing his criminal behavior when faced with scrutiny, Thompson had actually accelerated some of his schemes in an apparent attempt to generate cash flow for legal expenses and asset protection. This evidence undermined any possible claim that he had been unaware of the illegal nature of his actions. The defense's case was brief and largely focused on technical challenges to specific pieces of evidence rather than substantive arguments about Thompson's innocence. His attorneys attempted to portray him as an aggressive but legitimate businessman who had made mistakes in record-keeping and tenant relations, but hadn't intended to commit serious crimes. However, the extensive evidence of deliberate deception and the recorded statements about targeting specific tenants made this strategy ineffective. Thompson himself chose not to testify, which was probably wise given the extensive recorded evidence of his discriminatory statements and criminal planning. His silence in court stood in stark contrast to the arrogant confidence he'd displayed during our strategic planning meetings, when he'd been certain that his careful planning would protect him from consequences. Seeing him sitting quietly at the defense table, finally forced to confront the results of his actions, provided a sense of vindication that I'd been hoping for throughout the long investigation and trial process. The prosecution's closing argument connected Thompson's personal vindictiveness to his criminal behavior, arguing that his obsession with revenge had led him to pursue increasingly risky and illegal schemes to demonstrate his power over perceived enemies. The prosecutor emphasized that Thompson's targeting of vulnerable tenants wasn't just morally reprehensible, but had also been the catalyst for the financial crimes that formed the core of the federal charges against him. Jury deliberations lasted 2 days, during which housing advocates and former tenants maintained a vigil outside the courthouse. The extended deliberation period created anxiety about whether the technical nature of the financial evidence might confuse jurors, or whether Thompson's defense had been more effective than it appeared. However, David Kim reminded me that white-collar crime cases often involved complex evidence that required careful review, and longer deliberations didn't necessarily indicate uncertainty about guilt or innocence. When the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all 19 counts, the courtroom erupted in subdued celebration from Thompson's victims and their advocates. Thompson himself showed little visible reaction, though his attorneys immediately began discussing appeal strategies. For me, the moment felt like the end of a long journey that had begun with my accidental discovery of his revenge plot and culminated in comprehensive accountability for years of criminal behavior. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving federal probation officers time to prepare comprehensive reports about Thompson's criminal history and the impact of his actions on victims. During this period, dozens of former tenants submitted victim impact statements, describing how Thompson's discriminatory practices and financial schemes had affected their lives and housing security. The volume of victim statements illustrated the broad scope of harm that Thompson's behavior had caused throughout Austin's rental housing community. Mrs. Hoffman's victim impact statement was particularly eloquent, describing not just the personal stress she'd experienced, but also the broader damage that Thompson's actions had caused to trust between tenants and property owners. She wrote about the importance of stable housing for elderly residents and the psychological impact of facing potential displacement after living in the same community for decades. Her statement concluded with a call for sentences that would deter other property owners from similar behavior and protect vulnerable tenants from retaliatory actions. The federal sentencing guidelines suggested a prison term of 15 to 20 years for Thompson's crimes, but the final decision would depend on the judge's assessment of aggravating and mitigating factors. The prosecution argued for a sentence at the higher end of the guidelines, emphasizing the systematic nature of Thompson's criminal behavior and the vulnerable populations he had targeted. The defense requested leniency based on Thompson's lack of prior criminal history and his contributions to Austin's economic development through his real estate investments. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after I'd first walked into Thompson's downtown office for my job interview, full of hope about managing Riverside Manor and building positive relationships with residents. The symmetry wasn't lost on me as I entered the same federal courthouse where Thompson's trial had concluded, but this time I was there to witness the final chapter of a story that had transformed my understanding of justice, accountability, and the power of speaking truth to authority. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for thoughtful deliberation and sentences that balanced punishment with the goal of preventing future crimes. Her courtroom was again packed with journalists, housing advocates, and former tenants, all waiting to see whether Thompson would receive a sentence that matched the severity of his actions. Thompson himself appeared diminished compared to the confident businessman I'd once worked for, his expensive suits replaced by a standard gray jail uniform, and his commanding presence reduced to nervous fidgeting. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum had requested 22 years in federal prison, citing the extensive financial losses Thompson had caused, the vulnerable populations he had targeted, and the systematic nature of his criminal behavior over multiple years. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen argued that Thompson's actions represented a particularly egregious form of white-collar crime because he had exploited his position as a property owner to harm people who depended on him for basic housing security. Thompson's defense team had submitted their own memorandum requesting a sentence of 5 years, emphasizing his lack of prior criminal history, his cooperation with asset forfeiture proceedings, and letters of support from business associates who attested to his previous charitable contributions and community involvement. However, the defense's arguments were undermined by evidence that Thompson had continued his criminal activities even after investigations began, and had shown no remorse for the harm he'd caused to vulnerable tenants. The victim impact statements read during the hearing provided powerful testimony about the real-world consequences of Thompson's actions. Mrs. Hoffman spoke directly to the court about the fear and uncertainty that his threats had created for elderly residents who had nowhere else to go if forced from their homes. A young mother described how Thompson's selective enforcement of lease violations had pushed her family to the brink of homelessness, while he pursued his personal vendetta against tenant organizers. Marcus Chen also addressed the court, providing unique insight into Thompson's character and decision-making processes as his former business partner. Marcus testified that Thompson's vindictive behavior had escalated over time, progressing from verbal threats against perceived enemies to systematic criminal schemes designed to demonstrate his power and control. He emphasized that Thompson's actions had damaged not just individual victims, but the broader real estate community's reputation and ethical standards. My own victim impact statement focused on the professional and personal costs of witnessing Thompson's criminal behavior and making the difficult decision to report it. I described the stress of maintaining ethical standards while working for someone who was systematically violating legal and moral boundaries, and the courage required to risk my career and livelihood to protect vulnerable residents. I also emphasized the importance of encouraging other employees to report criminal activity they observe in their workplaces. Judge Williams listened carefully to all the victim statements and sentencing arguments before delivering her decision. She noted that Thompson's crimes represented a serious breach of trust between property owners and tenants, and that his targeting of vulnerable populations made his actions particularly harmful to community welfare. She also emphasized that his lack of remorse and continued criminal activity after investigations began demonstrated a pattern of behavior that required significant deterrence. The sentence Judge Williams imposed was 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and complete forfeiture of all assets derived from criminal activity. Thompson would also be required to pay full restitution to victims, though the amount would be determined through separate proceedings, since many of his assets were still being traced and recovered. The sentence was severe enough to satisfy most victims and advocates, while falling within established guidelines for similar white-collar crimes. Thompson's reaction to the sentence was minimal, though his attorneys immediately announced plans to appeal both the conviction and the sentence. However, the strength of the evidence and the careful adherence to legal procedures during the investigation and trial made successful appeals unlikely. For practical purposes, Thompson would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison, removing him from any position where he could harm vulnerable tenants or commit similar crimes. The forfeiture of Thompson's assets had significant positive consequences for his former tenants and the broader Austin housing community. Several of his properties were transferred to nonprofit housing organizations that specialized in affordable housing for low-income residents. Riverside Manor itself was purchased by a community land trust that guaranteed long-term affordability and gave residents a voice in management decisions. Mrs. Hoffman was elected to the trust's board of directors, bringing her decades of experience as a tenant advocate to the governance of her own housing community. The restitution proceedings took several months to complete, but ultimately resulted in payments to over 200 victims who had suffered financial losses from Thompson's criminal schemes. The amounts weren't large enough to fully compensate for all the harm he'd caused, but they provided tangible acknowledgement that his actions had real consequences for real people. Several victims used their restitution payments to cover moving expenses or security deposits for new housing, giving them fresh starts in communities with more ethical management. For me personally, Thompson's sentencing marked the end of a chapter that had begun with accidental discovery of his revenge plot and culminated in comprehensive accountability for systematic criminal behavior. The experience had taught me invaluable lessons about the importance of documenting workplace misconduct, the power of speaking up for vulnerable people, and the possibility of achieving justice, even against wealthy and influential adversaries. My work in affordable housing had flourished during the period of Thompson's prosecution, and I'd been promoted to oversee property management for the nonprofit's entire portfolio of senior housing developments. The position allowed me to implement the kind of ethical, resident-focused management practices that I'd always believed were possible but had never been able to fully realize in for-profit property management. Every day brought opportunities to make positive differences in people's lives through competent, compassionate housing services. The Thompson case had also opened doors for advocacy work that extended beyond direct property management. I'd been invited to serve on several housing policy committees and had testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger protection for tenant advocates and property management employees who report criminal activity. The specific examples from Thompson's case helped illustrate policy gaps and potential solutions in ways that abstract discussions never could. David Kim and I had also collaborated on developing training materials for property managers about recognizing and reporting discriminatory practices and financial fraud. The comprehensive documentation I'd maintained during my time working for Thompson became a case study for other employees who found themselves in similar situations. Several property managers had contacted me after attending these training sessions to discuss problems they'd observed and strategies for protecting both themselves and vulnerable tenants. 3 years after Thompson's sentencing, I received a letter from Mrs. Hoffman updating me on life at Riverside Manor under community ownership. Occupancy remained high, tenant satisfaction scores continued to improve, and the property had become a model for affordable housing management throughout Austin. She mentioned that Thompson's former office had been converted into a community meeting room where residents gathered for monthly potluck dinners and planning sessions for neighborhood improvement projects. The letter also included news that several other communities were replicating the Riverside Manor model, using community land trusts and resident governance to ensure long-term affordability and ethical management. Mrs. Hoffman had become something of a housing advocate celebrity, speaking at conferences and consulting with tenant organizations about strategies for community ownership and resident empowerment. Her transformation from potential victim of Thompson's revenge plot to influential housing advocate represented the kind of positive outcome that made all the stress and uncertainty of exposing his crimes worthwhile. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Thompson's vindictive obsession with revenge had ultimately created exactly the opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of silencing his opponents and demonstrating his power over vulnerable people, his criminal behavior had empowered tenant advocates, strengthened housing protections, and created lasting reforms that would benefit low-income residents for years to come. His targets not only survived his attacks, but had emerged stronger and more influential than ever before. The lesson I carried forward from the Thompson case was that ethical courage, careful documentation, and persistence could overcome even systematic criminal behavior by powerful people. The experience had required personal risks and professional sacrifices, but it had also demonstrated that individual actions could create meaningful change when supported by legal systems and community advocacy. For someone who'd started her career simply wanting to help tenants and property owners build positive relationships, ending up as an advocate for housing justice felt like the natural evolution of values I'd always held, but had never fully tested. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.